Good morning. In what has to be a big relief to the central government, rating agency Standard & Poor has just reaffirmed India's rating, and in fact, it is said that in FY22, the economy is likely to bounce back to I think a 7.5 or an 8% growth. So that's very good news for the central government. It reinforces what the chief economic advisor has been saying, that we're going to have a V-shaped recovery. In fact, Fitch has also reaffirmed India's rating. So all the worry that the central government had, that if the stimulus package was too large, India might get downgraded, and then people would FPI would have to move out of the country. So all of that has been those fears have been belied. I think the obvious question now is that given the fact that over a period of a few weeks, three rating agencies have reaffirmed India's rating. I mean, Moody's has downgraded it, but we are still at investment grade. Given this, the question is really whether India has done enough. Now, obviously, in retrospect, people would say that actually you should have done more. There are people such as the Planning Commission, the erstwhile Planning Commission's Pranab Sen, who has been arguing that actually unless you give a very big stimulus, large parts of the economy will become dysfunctional, and therefore the ability to bounce back next year is also under question. Now, this is something, frankly, nobody can prove whether Pranab Sen is right or wrong. But I think what it essentially means is that the central government will have to continue to be very watchful, and in case it needs to step up spending, it will need to do so. But as we've been saying all along, the more important thing really right now is for the central government to deliver on even what it has promised. The 3 lakh crore package for the MSME, for example, the loans from banks which are guaranteed by the central government, very little of that money, almost none of that money has been given by banks here. So banks are a bit nervous about giving money to SMEs since a large part of this is going to become dud loans very soon. So essentially, the government will have to work very hard to deliver on its promises, to coax the banks to actually give the money. As we said before, there are large reforms that the Prime Minister had promised. Very few of them have actually happened. The Essential Commodities Act is a very good example in this case, to illustrate what I'm saying. Essentially, what the Finance Minister had said was that the Essential Commodity Act would be relaxed so much that it would be easy for people to build up stocks for exporters, for processors, for other people. Now, what's happened is when the fine print came out, we find that the government is saying that if there's a 50% hike in prices, they may reimpose stocking limits. So it's a classic example of how the bureaucracy is managing to come back and stymie the reform efforts of the government. This is something that we talked about yesterday. Another very good example of just how lethargic India is and how fast it needs to move is on the front page of the Financial Express today. We know yesterday that Vietnam ratified the FTA with the EU. So today we have an analysis of what it actually means there. So Indian garment exporters will now end up paying about a 9.5 or 10% import duty when they export products to the EU, while those from Vietnam will pay no tax at all. Yeah? So that's a big advantage. And again, it tells you, so Vietnam already has an advantage in terms of being more competitive. Now it gets a 9.6% added advantage. And keep in mind that the EU accounts for about 30% of India's garment exports. So basically, there are lots of things like this that the Prime Minister needs to deliver on. So I think, while a lot of people have been focused on the size of the package, on the size of the stimulus, our whole point has been that forget about the size of the stimulus. It is really about the economic reforms. They're very slow in coming. The telecom reforms, we've been saying, have been waiting for 6 years since Mr. Modi has come, and he hasn't moved a bit on that. So that's the problem area. Very interesting in this context of how sclerotic government functioning is. We have an editorial on it. Our second editorial on this talks about, some years ago, the government came out or planned to come out with this thing called the Institute of Eminence. So these were top-notch universities, universities which had the potential of, really being world-class, and they were given an Institute of Eminence status here. Of course, the government sort of blotted its copybook, and the IOE, became somewhat of a joke, because one of the institutions to get an IOE status was the University by Reliance, a university which hadn't even dug its foundation by then. Yeah. So the IOE was off to a rocky start. But essentially what the IOE was, again, this tells you how bad policy making is in India. Essentially what the Institute of Eminence got was really, it got no great amount of money, it got nothing much. It got the freedom to set its own curriculum. It got the freedom to be away from the yoke of the UGC and the AICTE. So imagine the government of India sets up an entire scheme whose whole purpose is to free the universities from central government regulation. That's how bad regulation is. So what our editorial talks about is that some of these institutes of eminence have actually slipped in the global rankings of top universities. So it essentially means that despite talking about these being institutions of eminence, the government has not really freed them up. So once again, as I said, the decision making in India continues to be painfully slow. That's a reason for worrying. In fact, one of the points that we make in our editorial is that this is the buzzword today, is distance education. In fact, the Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman made some announcements on this as part of a reforms package when she announced it. But even as far as the distance education is concerned, we actually had universities which were certified by the UGC. So these were universities which are allowed, which the UGC thought were good enough to provide normal offline classroom education. But for some reason, they were not allowed to do online education. So that's it. So these are reasons to worry. Hopefully, these will be sorted out over the next few months. Because if they don't, then India just gets pushed further behind. While the bad news on corona is, it's happening every day in the sense of the numbers going up and the deaths going up. The good news here really is that as far as Bombay is concerned, Bombay was seen as this big hotspot. It was seen as going the New York way in terms of galloping infections. There were a lot of infection in slums like Dharavi, so that was expected that once infections were in Dharavi, they would spread like wildfire. As it is, we have lots of instances of people in Bombay not being able to find beds. Some people have even died on the way to the hospital, shuttling between hospitals looking for beds. And because the beds out there, the occupancy rates are about 94 to 95%. Now the good news here in Bombay, it may be temporary, but we need to celebrate it nonetheless and make sure that we can somehow manage to hold on to that advantage, build on it. The good news in Bombay is the municipality seems to have done a very, very good job in terms of quarantining people, isolating them, tracing them. So, while Dharavi used to have about 170 to 180 deaths a day in the early part of last month, according to the BMC officials, this was down to about 10 a couple of days ago. So that's very good news. In Worli also, you've had a reduction in the number of cases. The bad news here is that as far as Delhi and Chennai is concerned, the rates of growth are once again rising. So that's bad news. In fact, thanks to this, Delhi and Chennai are probably contributing as many fresh cases to the country's infections as Mumbai. They were much smaller just a few weeks ago. So that's bad news. As far as Delhi's bordering states are concerned, Haryana and Uttar Pradesh, they have seen a sharp surge in the number of cases around the time when the lockdown was eased and the border movement started getting easier. In fact, it's ironic because Chief Minister Kejriwal wanted to keep Delhi's beds only for Delhi citizens, and he kept arguing about how outsiders were coming and taking up the beds. Well, actually, if you ask these outsiders in Haryana and Uttar Pradesh, they'll probably tell you that we are getting more sick because of the infection levels in Delhi. So that's a worrying trend. If places like Haryana and Uttar Pradesh, the northeast, for example, if these places are seeing a surge in infections, that's a worrying area. And equally worrying is that the politics just never stops. I mean, we talked yesterday about how when the Lieutenant Governor rescinded the Kejriwal directive, basically reserving beds in Delhi for citizens of Delhi, when the Lieutenant Governor rescinded that order, then the Deputy Chief Minister basically talked about how cases in Delhi were going to jump to 5.5 lakhs by the end of July, and they would need 80,000 beds there. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, the Chief Minister, who has tested negative for corona, he was back in action yesterday, and he actually increased that number to 150,000. So he said that we will need the 80 or 90,000 beds that Mrs. Sisodia talked about, and the rest of the beds are something we are going to need to deal with the patients who come from outside. So I think the politics never stops. But the short point is that the number of beds which the government needs is a huge jump. They've got about 9,000 right now. So 150,000 divided by 9,000, you do the math. That's huge. There's no way they can achieve it. And so they're looking at barat ghars and banquet halls and things like that, where they can create some kind of facilities. We don't know if it's going to be enough. As we've been saying for a long time, it's time to call out the army, and let the army figure out, how to set up field hospitals. They've done quite good at it, so maybe they should do that. An interesting story, Corona related, but good news actually. An interesting story is by my colleague in Bombay, which is basically talking about pandemic housing here, pandemic-proof housing here. So basically, what some builders in Bombay seem to be doing is that they're trying to adjust to the new normal there. So work from home, I mean, almost everybody says is now part of the new normal there. So they're looking at how they can redo the houses a little bit to make sure there's a small study room in every house so that you can do your work from home. They're looking at whether the walls or the doors can be soundproofed a bit more, because you don't want to hear your dog barking when you're doing a Zoom call in the office or something like that, or making a recording like this one. So they're looking at soundproofing the doors a little bit. There's even talk of and some builders are talking about a little washroom right as soon as you enter the house. So as soon as you enter the house, the first thing that you do is to wash your hands, because hygienic conditions are the most important thing in this pandemic area. There are some builders who are adding a little kitchen garden. Basically the idea is that in case of a pandemic or something like that, the last thing you want to be doing is to go out to buy your vegetables. If you can grow your tomatoes and things like that in the garden, you've got to go out that much less. And I can tell you from personal experience, looking at my drawing room, some of the builders are looking at building small storerooms where you can just stock your potatoes, your biscuits, your atta and stuff like that. The kind of stuff that people like me, for example, have in our drawing room. So they're saying, okay, we'll give you a separate little storeroom to keep that. So that's pandemic proofing housing. Let's see if that takes off. And in fact, clearly housing is in a bad place right now. So the leading financier of housing, HDFC, is actually having an online mailer in Delhi NCR with about 150 projects which are going to be showcased from about 70 odd developers. And I suppose the idea is to, if people, looking at those fairs are saying that there's a housing finance company which is sort of attaching it or which is doing this thing, the builders are probably going to be of a certain class. The loan is almost, the builders are going to be probably solid builders who are going to deliver on time. The financing is short. So hopefully, that will get some offtake. Let's see how that takes off, but it's a good idea nonetheless to see, what this online mailer is going to look like. An interesting story is that of Tiger Global. Tiger Global, it's an investment firm which is one of the holders of Flipkart. And when Walmart spent $16 billion to buy Flipkart, buy the controlling stake in Flipkart, then one of the people who sold their shares to Walmart was Tiger Global. Now Tiger Global is headquartered out of Mauritius. So Tiger Global approached the Indian income tax authorities asking for a waiver and saying that because we are based out of Mauritius, we are covered by the double taxation avoidance agreement, so we will not have to pay any capital gains tax on it. The authority for advanced ruling said, I'm sorry, we're not going to give you that waiver because you may be based out of, you may be having an office in Mauritius, but essentially you're a US headquartered company. This is just tax avoidance, so we're not going to give it to you. So I think the taxman is actually right in this case. So what Tiger Global is likely to do is to approach the High Court on this, perhaps later on the Supreme Court, depending on how the verdict goes. So it'll be interesting to see how the courts rule on this, because it is very clear that there are a large number of companies that are based out of Mauritius only for tax purposes. So let's see how that goes. It's part of the double taxation. The government is trying to cracking down on tax avoidance. So let's see how this case goes. An interesting story is that OnePlus used to be called the iPhone killer. OnePlus is this famous Chinese phone model, and OnePlus has just come out with its latest or Series 8 phone, and there's a review in Financial Express which tells us about how good it is, the added features and things like that. And it's not unreasonably priced either. It's about 42,000 rupees for the entry model, and it goes up to 50 for the higher models with more storage and things like that. So let's see how this phone is. OnePlus has done very well so far, but over the last few weeks we've had this big clamor for boycotting Chinese goods. It's some government officials have talked about it privately. Social media is abuzz with it. So let's see how this goes. Let's see if you know if the majority of, I mean, if people who buy phones, let's see whether they're actually willing to give up Chinese mobile phones. My personal view is they won't. So let's track the OnePlus and let's see where that goes. Thank you. Have a great day.